The world was bracing for major changes with only a few days left until the upcoming International Guild Conference, an event set to bring together the world's most powerful guilds under one roof. But just days before the prestigious summit, a major turning point quietly unfolded in the heart of America. A helicopter descended onto the grounds of a vast luxurious estate nestled in the countryside. The mansion belonged to Christopher Reed, one of the few national-level hunters in existence. As the blade slowed, Christopher emerged onto the front steps, watching as the vice director of the Hunter Command Center stepped out, followed by a composed but tensile-looking Norma Selner. He raised an eyebrow, mildly surprised to see them. He hadn't been informed of any visits today. Still, he motioned for them to come inside, his voice cool as he noted that if they were here about a newly spawned S-rank gate out east, they were wasting their time. He had no interest in getting involved. But the vice director shook his head, saying that it wasn't about a gate. It was something far more urgent. Christopher led them into a private room and instructed his maid to ensure no one came near. As they settled, he sat comfortably and asked what this was really about. He could already tell from their faces that it wasn't routine business. Norma Selner sat down across from him, her tone calm but firm as she explained that this visit wasn't about a crisis. They had come to warn him. According to her visions, his life was in danger. He would be murdered soon. A nerve hit Christopher the moment the words slipped from Miss Selner's mouth. He slammed his teacup onto the table, the sharp clink slicing through the heavy silence. Without looking up, his voice dropped low and serious as he said he was grateful for everything she had done for him in the past. But they weren't close enough for her to make jokes like this. Then his gaze slowly lifted to meet hers, cold and sharpened, a quiet storm in his eyes. Christopher reminded her who she was speaking to. The weight in his voice pressed into the room like a vice. Despite the pressure, Miss Selner didn't flinch. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, recalling the vision that haunted her. She calmly revealed that she had dreamt of him recently, surrounded by men with a heavy sense of danger closing in on him. It wasn't a vague unease. It was certainty. She knew he was going to die. But Christopher's patience had already begun to fracture. The idea that she'd flown all the way out here to spout what he saw as nonsense left a sour taste in his mouth. His tone rose, edged with anger, as he questioned whether she really expected a national-level hunter to believe he could be killed. Unmoved, Miss Selner pushed forward. She spoke of fate, inevitability, and the one sliver of hope she believed still existed. Christopher scoffed at the idea, asking if she truly thought there was anyone in this world capable of protecting someone like him. He declared with full confidence that no such person existed, but Miss Selner disagreed. "There might be one," she said quietly. Christopher narrowed his eyes, watching her carefully as she uttered a name, Sung Jinwoo. He fell silent, a flicker of uncertainty passing over his expression as Miss Selner turned and walked out, leaving behind only doubt in her wake. That night at Christopher Reed's mansion, the atmosphere was thick and heavy, the kind of silence that felt too perfect. Christopher lay asleep in his bed, but the calm was broken as he abruptly sat up, eyes sharp. Something had stirred him. He slipped on his robe and stepped out into the dim hallway, guided by instinct rather than reason. As he walked, the unnatural stillness clung to him. It wasn't just quiet. It was wrong. Suspicion rising, Christopher grabbed a wine glass from a nearby table and in one swift motion hurled it down the empty corridor. The glass shattered, but no sound followed. That silence confirmed it. Something was here. A chill ran through him as his thoughts drifted back to Miss Selner and the vice director to their warning. He hadn't believed them, but now he felt it. Something powerful lurked nearby. Just then, a man with blonde hair appeared, standing at the far end of the hall with a serene smile, his hands tucked behind his back. Christopher's senses flared. Two more presences stood behind him, silent but unmistakable. Without turning, he demanded they reveal themselves. But the blonde man wasn't focused on him. He raised his gaze slightly and in the language of monsters spoke directed not at Christopher, but at something beyond. He said that if the fragment of light continued to accommodate humans, no one would be saved. Christopher's brow furrowed. The words made no sense. What was he talking about? But the man dismissed him, told him to be silent, claiming the conversation wasn't meant for him. He was speaking to something above Christopher, something connected to him. Those words struck a nerve. In an instant, fire surged around Christopher, his body ignited, his form expanding and morphing until it became something no longer human. Engulfed in flames, he declared with fury that at least one of them would die here. The two figures standing behind him watched his transformation in awe, unable to comprehend how a human could achieve spiritualization. But Christopher didn't wait. He lunged forward at the blonde intruder, unleashing his power. Flames roared through the mansion, devouring everything in their path as the clash shook the very walls. The outcome of the battle remained unknown, but the destruction it left behind was undeniable. Meanwhile, in Japan, it was Jinwoo's last day as he headed toward the airport in a sleek black car, accompanied by a full convoy. The streets were flooded with thousands of people, all gathered for one last glimpse of the man who had saved their city. The sheer number of onlookers had even Baru suggesting that his liege raise a hand like a king to acknowledge them. But Jinwoo shut the idea down without hesitation. He wasn't interested in basking in attention. The convoy soon reached the airport. Jinwoo exchanged brief farewells with the officials before boarding his flight back to Korea. As he settled into his seat, he noticed a familiar face in the seat beside him, Adam White of the Federal Bureau of Hunters. Jinwoo couldn't help but wonder if this was just coincidence or another deliberate approach by the Bureau. Adam didn't beat around the bush. With a shrug, he admitted it outright. Jinwoo greeted him coolly, recalling their previous meeting, and asked what brought him here this time. Adam, well aware that showing up unannounced crossed a few lines, explained there was something urgent he needed to discuss. Immediately, Jinwoo's mind went to the worst. He asked if the U.S. had failed to contain the S-rank gate. Adam quickly reassured him it had been handled, but what he had to show Jin, something far more serious. Wasting no time, Adam pulled out his laptop and opened a video file. The screen showed thick black smoke curling into the sky like from a massive wildfire. Flames blazed violently, firefighters scrambling to get control as chaos unfolded. Jinwoo's eyes narrowed as he studied the footage and asked what exactly he was looking at. Adam's tone turned grim as he revealed the truth. The man responsible for the destruction was Christopher Reed. Despite deploying 1,800 firefighters and 14 high-tier hunters, they had struggled to contain the fire that Christopher had unleashed. Jinwoo instantly recognized the scale of the disaster. For flames that wild, there had to have been a serious battle. He asked what had become of Christopher. Adam paused the video, freezing it on an image of Christopher's scorched body, riddled with wounds. He said that by the time they found him, Christopher was already dead. Then Adam reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a photograph. The man they believed was behind the incident. The moment Jinwoo laid eyes on the picture, something in him snapped. Without warning, he activated ruler's authority. Adam was yanked from his seat midair, crushed invisibly by immense pressure as his laptop was flattened into scrap. Screaming in pain, Adam found himself at the mercy of Jinwoo's darkened gaze. Jinwoo warned him coldly that if this was some kind of twisted joke, Adam wouldn't leave the plane alive. Panicked, Adam waved off the bodyguards who had started to react. He hurriedly explained that the man in the photo had emerged from a dungeon, that it might not be who Jinwoo thought. Still struggling to breathe, Adam went on. The man's energy felt less like a hunter's and more like a monster's. He revealed that the explosion at the Hunter Bureau's headquarters a few months ago was this man's doing too. Jinwoo slowly released his grip, letting ruler's authority fade. The name of his father, the face in that photo, all of it churned inside him in disbelief. As tension started to ease, Adam, still catching his breath, continued. The suspect had already attacked several S-rank hunters before disappearing. He acknowledged the emotional weight of what this meant for Jinwoo, but said all signs still pointed to the man in the photo. Jinwoo, his expression now unreadable, asked why Adam had shown this to him. Adam replied that it concerned the upcoming International Guild Conference. The U.S. Bureau planned to issue a red notice on the suspect. Until now, the investigation had been confidential, but that was about to change. They wanted to give Jinwoo advance notice before making the wanted poster public at the conference he was scheduled to attend. The U.S. Hunter Association had lost a national-level hunter. They were prepared to pursue the culprit with everything they had. And out of respect, they had decided to tell Jinwoo first. Jinwoo sat there silent. His father, missing for 10 years, had returned, and possibly not as the man he once was. That truth weighed heavily on him. Adam, meanwhile, despite the pain still lingering in his chest, found himself quietly awed. Telekinesis wasn't unheard of among high-tier magic hunters. But what Jinwoo had just demonstrated was on an entirely different scale. It was the kind of power only national-level hunters could wield. There was no longer any doubt in Adam's mind. Jinwoo was the 6th national-level hunter, a fact the vice director would need to hear. The anticipation surrounding the International Guild Conference only intensified with time. The U.S. Hunters Association soon released the official list of participating guilds, and one name in particular caught the world's attention: Korea's Ahjin Guild. Discussions ignited across the globe. People questioned the rationale behind inviting a guild with only a single high-ranking hunter. But the message was clear that one hunter was worth more than all the guilds boasting multiple top-class hunters combined. Jinwoo's name was everywhere. As the conference neared, he became the focal point of global attention, and the first ripple of its impact reached the Korean Hunter Association. Chief Woo Jinchul entered President Go's office with an urgent report in hand. He explained that China had submitted a request for information on Jinwoo, specifically raid records and any published data related to him. President Go raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled. He couldn't understand why China would be after Jinwoo when the hunter had already made it clear that he had no interest in joining foreign organizations or leaving Korea. But Jinchul clarified that the request hadn't come from the Chinese government. It came from an individual. The moment he revealed the name, President Go froze. Liu Jiegong, China's 7-star hunter, had personally asked for Jinwoo's information. The thought that someone of Liu Jiegong's caliber had taken an interest in Jinwoo hit President Go hard. Jinchul added that it likely had something to do with Liu's past battle against a giant monster. After hearing of Jinwoo's solo annihilation of the giants in Japan, Liu Jiegong had grown curious about the Korean hunter's capabilities. A knowing smile spread across President Go's face as he absorbed the revelation. Then, with a wave of his hand, he ordered Janti to reject the request or at most provide only surface-level data. Nothing substantial about Jinwoo was to be shared. Meanwhile, at the Scavenger Guild, the atmosphere was heavy as preparations for the conference ramped up. Laura entered Thomas Andre's office with an update. Jinwoo was scheduled to arrive in the country the next day. As Thomas reviewed his calendar, the door creaked open. The person he'd summoned had arrived. Without any build-up, Thomas stepped forward, his expression firm, and delivered his warning. No matter what happened, Sunung Jinwoo was not to be touched. Huang Dongsu's face tightened with a mix of nervousness and barely contained frustration. Thomas saw it and continued, making it clear he knew everything that had gone down between Jinwoo and Dongsu's brother. He understood Dongsu's thirst for closure, but that was all in the past. Dongsu opened his mouth to protest, but Thomas lifted a finger. The weight of his presence silenced Dongsu instantly. Fear flickered in the S-rank hunter's eyes as he stood frozen under the guild master's pressure. From across the room, Laura watched it all unfold. The tension was unmistakable. Very few people in the world could deliver such a command to someone like Dongsu. But Thomas was not most people. Placing a heavy hand on Dongsu's shoulder, Thomas repeated himself. No contact with Jinwoo, no matter the circumstance. To remove Dongsu from the equation during the conference, Thomas suggested a vacation at the guild resort, far from the action. A long pause followed. Then Dongsu finally gave a stiff nod, jaw clenched before turning and leaving the office. But even after his departure, Laura could feel it. Dongsu hadn't truly let go of his grudge. She turned to Thomas, questioning whether it was wise to let him walk out so easily. Thomas, well aware of the risk, gave his response without hesitation. Dongsu wasn't one to back down, which is why Laura was to keep a close eye on him until Jinwoo left the country. Otherwise, he warned Dongsu wouldn't live to see another day. Finally, the day arrived. The top hunters from the world's most powerful guilds landed in the United States for the International Guild Conference. The air buzzed with excitement, and the energy in the crowd was electric. Among the arrivals stood Leonard Neerman, Germany's top hunter and guild master of the Art OR Guild. Reporters swarmed like bees, cameras flashing nonstop. Leonard, noting the chaos ahead, glanced at his vice guild master and asked what all the noise was about. The man explained that the Korean hunter everyone had been talking about had just landed. Leonard's eyes scanned the crowd until they fell on Jinwoo across the lot. He nodded slightly, deciding he should take the opportunity to introduce himself and build rapport. Straightening his coat and adjusting his steps with confidence, he moved forward, but then without warning, stopped cold. His vice guild master looked puzzled, asking if he was going to keep walking. Leonard, still staring, muttered under his breath as realization struck. He had assumed Jinwoo summoned his shadow army from another dimension. But this was different. They were walking with him always. Leonard didn't see a hunter arriving for a conference. He saw a king arriving for war. Jinwoo, aware of the eyes locked on him, looked over subtly. Jinho, noticing the glance, asked if someone caught his eye. Jinwoo simply replied that some foreigner had been staring for a while, prompting Jinho to chuckle and joke that maybe the guy was a fan, hoping for an autograph. Before the conversation could continue, Adam White approached with a team from the U.S. Hunters Bureau. He welcomed the group with professional ease, handling the pleasantries quickly before directing staff to escort Jinho and Woo Jinsha to their rooms. But when he asked Jinwoo to stay back for a separate matter, the Korean hunter's expression immediately hardened. He wanted to know if this was about his father again. Adam reassured him that it wasn't. This had nothing to do with threats or danger. In fact, quite the opposite. The Bureau held him in the highest regard. Still unconvinced, Jinwoo pressed further, but Adam kept things vague, mentioning only that it was a top-secret matter they would discuss at the Bureau headquarters. During the drive, the tension in Adam's voice rose as he explained the ongoing internal problems. Christopher Reed's death, still hidden from the public, had left a gaping hole in the Bureau's strength. Resources were now being funneled toward finding someone capable of replacing him. And when Jinwoo asked whether he was one of the potential candidates, Adam gave a silent nod that said everything. Without dragging things further, Adam activated the center console and a hologram came to life. Kamish's corpse appeared, towering and lifeless alongside a glowing runestone pulsing with power. Adam explained the runestone's origin and its unmatched potential. It had come from one of humanity's greatest calamities and had remained sealed until now, waiting for someone worthy. And in their eyes, Jinwoo was that someone. But Jinwoo didn't answer immediately. Instead, his focus shifted as he asked Adam to rewind the image, stopping at the hologram of Kamish's corpse. Jinwoo stared at it longer than Adam expected before asking if the body was truly stored intact. Adam hesitated before confirming that it had been preserved. Jinwoo, now firm in his tone, requested to see it. Caught off guard, Adam tried to explain that even he didn't know its exact location, that it was highly classified. But Jinwoo reminded him of all the time and cooperation he'd given the Bureau so far, implying this was hardly too much to ask. Adam, uncertain but aware of the weight behind Jinwoo's request, agreed and contacted the higher-ups for clearance to access Kamish's corpse. Soon, their car pulled into the Hunter Command Center, and word of Jinwoo's arrival quickly reached Director David Brennan. Surprised by the unplanned visit, David immediately questioned whether Jinwoo had said anything about the runestone, clearly expecting that to be the main agenda. But Adam explained that the topic had barely come up all day, which only deepened David's confusion. Why was Jinwoo so insistent on seeing Kamish's corpse? Perplexed, David stepped away to consult with the deputy director. As the two discussed behind closed doors, the deputies speculated on Jinwoo's intentions. While most hunters would have been drawn to the immense power runestones offered, especially one extracted from a creature like Kamish. Perhaps for Jinwoo, the corpse itself held greater value. David's brow furrowed as he recalled how Jin's powers worked, how they were tied to the monsters he personally defeated. That was when it finally hit the deputy. His eyes widened in shock. Jinwoo wasn't there to marvel at Kamish. He was there to turn the mighty dragon into a summon. The realization struck hard, and David rose abruptly from his chair, stunned by the possibility. The idea of someone controlling a beast like Kamish was terrifying in itself. But before he could voice his opposition, the deputy reminded him of the political weight behind this interaction. Denying Jinwoo could shatter their delicate diplomatic ties, especially when their country already stood vulnerable after Christopher Reed's death. After a long silence, David finally relented. He decided to take responsibility himself and accompanied Jinwoo to Kamish's chamber, reasoning that witnessing the act firsthand would be the best way to assess the risk. Together with Adam, he led Jinwoo into the elevator, descending into the heavily restricted sublevels beneath the command center. As they stepped out onto the underground floor, David gestured silently down the long corridor where a massive armored door waited at the far end. The moment they neared it, a chill clung to the air. Jinwoo felt it seep through his skin. The magical energy was dense, oppressive, almost sentient. His thoughts raced as he imagined the possibilities if Kamish were to become one of his shadow soldiers. When the door finally opened, Jinwoo was met with the sight he had come for. In the heart of a cavernous chamber lit by cold white lights, Kamish's body rested undisturbed, towering and intact. Its presence alone was enough to command silence. The dragon's scales shimmered faintly even in death, as if its power had refused to fade. David, trying to regain composure, explained how the corpse had been preserved exactly as it was after the raid that took the lives of hundreds of elite hunters. His words barely registered to Jinwoo, who had already started moving forward, eyes locked onto the giant carcass. Without waiting for further clearance, he calmly instructed David and the staff to stand back. When the deputy protested, unsure whether it was safe, David assured him that they had already given Jinwoo clearance, and now they would see for themselves what he intended. Standing in front of Kamish, Jinwoo raised his hand, the air around him beginning to distort. His voice, steady and quiet, carried a single word: arise. Dark energy erupted, flowing like liquid smoke toward the dragon's body. The chamber's lights flickered, but then came a sudden halt. A prompt flashed before Jinwoo, informing him that the shadow extraction had failed. Jinwoo, however, didn't flinch. He had 2 more attempts. Reining in his power, he focused, ignoring the gasps from behind as the ground trembled again. The command left his lips once more. This time, the shadow responded. A deafening roar shook the chamber as Kamish's body twitched, then surged upward, the immense power coursing through its veins once again as it rose from death. Lights exploded overhead while the structure groaned under the pressure of the awakening beast. Kamish stood, its shadow formed towering over them all. The dragon's eyes scanned its surroundings before locking onto Jinwoo. Then, as if remembering something buried deep within, Kamish spoke, not with anger, but recognition. It addressed Jinwoo not as a stranger, but as the Shadow Monarch, the King of the Dead. Panic broke out among the staff. Adam froze, disbelief etched across his face. David could barely breathe as he watched the scene unfold, while others staggered backward, unable to comprehend what was happening. Kamish's eyes drifted toward the human standing behind Jinwoo. Its voice dropped into a growl, and in the next moment the chamber darkened under the weight of its murderous intent. A low snarl rippled from its throat as it vowed death upon every human in sight. The room shook violently, cracks splitting across the reinforced walls, barriers infused with top-ranker mana now splintering like glass under the weight of Kamish's fury. From a distance, David watched in terror as Kamish's mouth began to glow, the ominous light signaling the buildup of its most devastating attack, dragon breath. He braced himself as the chamber's integrity began to crumble, knowing full well they wouldn't survive what was coming. But before Kamish could unleash its wrath, Jinwoo's voice cut through the roar with absolute command. His tone was cold, authoritative, beyond negotiation. He reminded Kamish that the mana crystal embedded in its skull, the very source of its obedience to the rulers, was gone. The dragon froze. The glow faded. Its fury flickered, then dissolved. Adam could barely process what he was seeing. He asked half to himself whether Jinwoo had truly just spoken in the tongue of monsters. The deputy standing beside him was equally stunned by the sight before them. Kamish, once humanity's worst nightmare, now stood solemn before Jinwoo. The anger had faded from its eyes, replaced by something deeper. Recognition. It spoke again, slower this time, with the calm acceptance of one who understood its new place. Once it had served the King of Dragons, now it knelt before Jinwoo, acknowledging him as its new sovereign. Jinwoo slowly approached the towering dragon and rested his hand gently on Kamish, his voice low as he asked whether Kamish had truly served the King of Dragons. The dragon confirmed it had, revealing that it once followed the King of Mad Dragons, known as the Monarch of Destruction. As Jinwoo absorbed the weight of those words, his eyes lingered on the immense rage still radiating from Kamish. It stunned him to realize that even as a summon, Kamish retained such a strong, independent will. He stood in silence, mind drifting back to the vision the system had once shown him, the 9 monarchs. There was the King of the Dead, the Shadow Monarch, and the King of the Giants, the Monarch of the Beginning. And now another piece of the puzzle fit into place. Kamish had once served yet another monarch, one whose power was rooted in destruction. But the moment of revelation didn't last. Kamish, its voice tinged with finality, told Jinwoo that their time together was short. Trapped in the abyss for too long, its magic was fading fast. As the dragon's form began to crumble, dust falling from its body like ash in the wind. It explained that 8 long years had drained it of all strength. Jinwoo's eyes widened in disbelief. Even with the powers of the Shadow Monarch, was he truly powerless against time? A desperate plea echoed within him as he called out to the system for help, but the system remained silent. Kamish's voice grew fainter, speaking its final thoughts with quiet resignation. It envied the shadow soldiers who could remain by Jinwoo's side forever. Then, with what little strength it had left, it offered a warning about 4 humans who had borrowed the power of the rulers and urged Jinwoo to be wary of them. Jinwoo remained still, watching helplessly as Kamish's massive frame slowly vanished. The mighty dragon reduced to particles of light fading into the void. A notification soon appeared before him, stating that the shadow extraction had failed. Without a word, Jinwoo turned back and called out to Adam, telling him to inform Director David of his apologies and that he would personally cover any damages caused. The frustration gnawed at him as he walked away from the ruined lair. His clenched fist trembled with anger, and with a sudden burst of emotion, he struck the wall beside him. The force of the blow shook the building for a brief moment, leaving David and Adam frozen where they stood, stunned into silence. As Jinwoo emerged from the facility, Chief Wu Jincho was already waiting outside, concern etched across his face. He mentioned they'd been trying to reach him for a while, but every attempt had failed. Jinwoo, still weary from everything that had transpired, simply said he'd been in a place where no calls could get through. Jincho then asked if he had seen Jinho. The question caught Jinwoo off guard. He frowned, asking what Jinsel meant. Jingxiel explained that Jinho had left hours ago after receiving a message allegedly from Jinwoo claiming he was waiting at the Hunter Bureau's headquarters. Jinwoo, visibly confused now, replied that he hadn't sent any such message and had just come from the Bureau himself. Jinho hadn't been there. Adam, who had caught part of the conversation, stepped in and confirmed that Jinho's name hadn't appeared in the visitor logs either. Jinsel nodded grimly, recalling that a hunter from the Scavenger Guild had come by to pick Jinho up 2 hours earlier. The air turned heavy with urgency as Adam quickly suggested contacting the Scavenger Guild directly. No time was wasted. He pulled out his phone and placed the call. Laura answered, and the moment Adam relayed what had happened, her face shifted. Her voice tightened as she asked if Jinwoo was aware. Adam admitted he didn't know the full details yet, only that Jinho was missing and they were actively searching. Laura didn't need to hear more. She understood the danger immediately and promised to find out what had happened as fast as possible. Adam turned back to update Jinwoo. But Jinwoo was already gone. Above the city rooftops, Jinwoo surged forward in great bounding leaps, a blur of speed cutting across the skyline. Unease churned inside him like a storm. He cursed himself for being careless, for not assigning someone to guard Jinho. He should have been more cautious. The memory of the incident at Jaw's school resurfaced sharply in his mind, and the thought of history repeating itself made his chest tighten with dread. Without hesitation, he extended his hand and summoned his army. Shadows erupted beneath his feet, stretching outward like a black tide. Thousands of shadow soldiers swept through streets, alleys, and skies with a single purpose: to find Jinho. Jinwoo stood atop a towering skyscraper, the wind whipping against his coat as he scanned the city below with sharp, narrowed eyes. Worry crept behind the intensity in his gaze, a rare flicker of emotion breaking through his usual calm. His enhanced perception let him pick out every movement, every face in the streets far beneath him. Yet there was still no sign of Jinho. His thoughts ran wild. Maybe Jinho had left the city. But it didn't make sense. It wasn't like Jinho to vanish without a word. He was a combat-type dank, not someone who would go down without a fight. And then there was that one name tying everything together: Scavenger Guild. Jinwoo's mind raced as the name Huang resurfaced in his thoughts. The man had likely been waiting for this moment, predicting their arrival in America with eerie precision. Dongsu wanted answers. Answers about his brother's death. Jinho and he had been the only survivors of that dungeon. The memory of Shaw's old warning echoed in his mind like a prophecy fulfilled. He didn't regret what he did in that dungeon. But now, standing helpless above a city that offered no clues, he couldn't stop the burning thought. He should have assigned someone to protect Jinho. Meanwhile, tension grew inside the Scavenger Guild's headquarters. Thomas sat stiffly in his chair, his fingers laced as report after report brought no progress. His hunters had turned up nothing. He couldn't understand what Dongsu was thinking. As an S rank, Dongsu wasn't unaware of the power gap between himself and Jinwoo. Thomas realized that Dongsu's reckless actions could only mean one thing. He was counting on him to step in. Without waiting, he picked up his phone and rang Laura. Laura informed him that with help from the Hunter Bureau, they'd traced Dongsu's movements over the last month and narrowed down 3 potential locations. Thomas didn't hesitate. He ordered full deployment. Every available guild member was to sweep those sites, and he would head out personally. But just before ending the call, something nagged at him. He asked how Laura had managed to get the Bureau to move so quickly. Her reply was simple but heavy. She told them the truth that if Dongsu wasn't found soon, it would come down to a clash between Thomas Andre and Sung Jinwoo. At the Hunter Bureau, the news hit like a shock wave. Adam relayed the update to the staff. Scavenger Guild had led all its scheduled raids. Every member had been mobilized. They were treating this like a crisis. The deputy director paused mid-step when he heard. The scale of the operation said everything. If the entire Scavenger Guild was moving, then Thomas Andre wasn't just aware. He was personally involved. This wasn't some internal dispute anymore. Something massive was unfolding. And the entire guild was racing to stop it before it reached the point of no return. The heart of the chaos lay inside a long-abandoned factory in the United States. Inside, Jinho lay unconscious on the cold concrete floor, bruised and bloodied, while a few men loomed over him. One among them, voice laced with uncertainty, questioned whether they were really okay with this. Dongsu, standing over Jinho with a look of disdain, dismissed the concern with a cold assurance that everything was under control. He wasn't planning to kill the kid, just get a few answers. He remembered Thomas's stern warning not to provoke Jinwoo, but Dongsu had never planned to confront Jinwoo directly. His sights had always been set on Jinho. He needed the truth. The one that haunted him. The confirmation that Jinwoo was the one who had killed his brother. That single truth would be enough to end it. Without waiting further, Dongsu slapped Jinho hard across the face in an attempt to wake him. When the blow didn't stir him, Dongsu's patience snapped. He drove his fist into Jinho's already bruised ribs. The force of it dragged a tortured scream from Jinho's throat, and blood spilled from his mouth as his eyes fluttered open, dazed and in pain. From the side, one of Dongsu's men watched silently, commenting almost clinically on Jinho's toughness, noting that an average man would have died from such abuse by now. Dongsu, clearly unimpressed by Jinho's endurance, clenched his fists with growing irritation. He was done playing nice. Grabbing Jinho by the hair, he slammed his head into the wall, the impact echoing through the empty building. Then, dragging him back upright, Dongsu leaned in close and muttered with quiet menace that while he had no intention of killing him just yet, he would keep torturing him and heal him each time he hovered on the edge of death until he finally confessed. He reminded Jinho that this factory was deserted, that no one could hear him scream, and no one would be coming to save him. He then asked, voice dipped in mockery, whether the pain had finally loosened his tongue. Jinho, barely conscious and drenched in his own blood, was still defiant. With a pained groan, he lifted a trembling hand, raised his middle finger, and raised a curse through split lips. Dongsu's rage erupted. He slammed Jinho's head into the wall once more. And this time, Jinho's body slumped to the ground, motionless, his strength drained, his will barely clinging to consciousness. From behind, the same worried subordinate stepped forward, his voice cautious as he reminded Dongsu to be careful, hinting at the mess they'd have to clean up if things went too far. Dongsu didn't even bother to look at him. He simply muttered that he hadn't even gotten started yet, his lips curling into a sinister smile that mirrored the cruelty of the brother he had lost. Just as he stepped forward to continue, something shifted in the dim light at the far end of the factory. Dongsu's eyes narrowed, catching sight of a high orc standing still in the shadows. Confused, he wondered if a dungeon break had happened nearby. But what unsettled him more was the orc's behavior. It wasn't snarling or attacking. The creature stood frozen, trembling in fear as it sensed an overwhelming presence rapidly approaching. And it wasn't Dongsu. Meanwhile, Dongsu didn't hesitate. He charged at the creature, ready to strike it down with a single blow. But before the blow could land, a deep voice cut through the stillness. Exchange. At the same time, on the other side of the world, Jinwoo's mother sat in the living room, her brows furrowed as she watched the television intently. The screen was flooded with breaking news, reports of strange, dangerous events cropping up across the globe. Her voice trembled slightly as she voiced her worries aloud, wondering if Jinwoo was doing all right in the midst of all the chaos. Biro, tasked with watching over Jinmi's mother, and Ja observed her with quiet reverence. From the shadows, he silently assured her, if there was anything their king couldn't overcome, then nothing in this world could. The broadcast shifted, cutting to live footage from a conference in the US. The camera briefly captured Jinwoo as he stepped onto the scene. Jinwoo's mother pointed toward the screen, calling Jaina's attention to it with a hint of pride in her voice. Biru's gaze also lingered on the screen, reverent and proud. But then, without warning, his entire body tensed. A cold shiver ran through him as a surge of dark, violent energy washed over his senses. He had felt this once before, the unmistakable sensation of Jinwoo's wrath. The king was angry and it pierced through dimensions like a blade. Back in America, Thomas Andre, racing toward one of the suspected locations, suddenly froze in his seat. A feeling deep and overwhelming gripped his instincts. Without warning, he shouted for the car to stop, startling the driver. When hesitation met his command, Thomas roared again, this time with more force, and the sheer pressure in his voice left no room for delay. The car was still moving when Thomas slammed the door open with brute force. Without a second thought, he leaped out, the concrete beneath him shattering as he landed. He shouted back to the hunters still seated behind him, ordering them to catch up as fast as they could. Then, in a blur of motion and destruction, Thomas took off, cutting through the cityscape like a missile, driven by instinct and urgency. Meanwhile, inside the abandoned factory, everything changed in an instant. Out of nowhere, a fist crashed into Dongsu's stomach with devastating force. The impact lifted him off his feet, his body sailing across the factory before slamming into the far wall. Blood sprayed from his mouth as the shock wave rippled through the building. The men who had stood beside him blinked, trying to process what had just happened. On the cold floor, Jinho, barely holding on, managed a faint smile. Relief washed over his fading eyes as they locked onto the familiar figure now standing before him. The factory air grew thick and heavy, crackling with pressure. The presence now in the room was overwhelming, undeniable, and filled with pure, unfiltered rage. And there he stood, eyes blazing with fury. His gaze was locked onto Dongsu, not as a warning, but as a sentence. His arrival wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet and final, like death itself had stepped into the room. Jinwoo had arrived. He rushed to Jinho's side without hesitation, gently tilting his head and pouring a healing potion into his mouth. But almost immediately, a cold system notification flashed before Jinwoo's eyes. Healing potions couldn't restore health once it dropped below 10% of a person's total HP. The message was a cruel reminder. Jinho was too close to death. Frustration surged through him. Time was running out. Turning sharply to the two men nearby, Jinwoo's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and demanding, as he asked if either of them was a healer. The question wasn't a plea. It was an order. The one closest to him hesitated, clearly shaken, and then muttered something about not understanding Korean. Dongsu, having just pulled himself together from Jinwoo's earlier strike, seized the moment to speak up, casually translating the request to his men, as if this were just a routine introduction between acquaintances. Jinwoo didn't even spare him a glance. His gaze remained locked on the two men, his voice now even colder as he repeated his demand, this time laced with deadly intent. One of them, clearly the healer, let out a scoff and dared to smirk. With arrogant confidence, he said Jinwoo should convince his boss first before making requests of him. But before he could finish his sentence, Jinwoo flashed forward, grabbed the man's head, and slammed it into the nearby pillar with brutal force. Bone cracked, and the smirk disappeared beneath a spray of blood. Without pause, Jinwoo shifted to the second man, his patience now hanging by a thread. He asked again, this time with deadly clarity, if the man could heal. The man raised his hands, stammering an answer, but never got to finish it. A heavy force crashed his head into the concrete, silencing him instantly. Dongsu, now burning with rage, stepped forward, his voice seething as he demanded to know if Jinwoo had killed his brother. On the ground, Jinho stirred faintly. With great effort, he whispered Jinwoo's name, trying to warn him. But Jinwoo, in a calm voice, reassured him and told Jinho to rest and not speak. Dongsu didn't stop. He stepped closer again, demanding an answer. Jinwoo's eyes turned to ice as he finally responded, not with an admission, but with a chilling suggestion, to go ask his brother himself. The words struck deep. Dongsu roared, his fist flying straight for Jinwoo's face. But Jinwoo was faster. He slipped past the punch and retaliated with a blow that sunk deep into Dongsu's gut. Dongsu coughed blood midair before crashing into a maze of iron pipes. The impact echoed with brutal finality. He tried to move, tried to rise, but before he could fully register what had happened, Jinwoo was already crouched low beside him, his presence like death itself. Dongsu howled and lunged. But Jinwoo's fist came down again, crushing his head into the pipes. But Jinwoo didn't stop there. His grip tightened around Dongsu's skull as he slammed it again and again, blood splattering with each impact. The brutal thuds echoed through the empty space, and Jinwoo remained locked in, hell-bent on crushing whatever resistance was left in Dongsu's broken body. Then a deafening crash tore through the factory as the ceiling above exploded, and Thomas Andre landed with a quake. Dust and rubble rained around him as he rose from the crater, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. His voice rang out, calm yet commanding, as he demanded Jinwoo to stop. He reminded Dongsu of the warning he had once given him not to touch Jinwoo. And now, seeing his guild mate battered and broken, he asked flatly if Dongsu was still alive. Jinwoo, still holding Dongsu by the head, replied coldly that he wasn't done yet. Thomas exhaled slowly and offered a way out. He stated that if Jinwoo released Dongsu, he would overlook what had occurred. Jinwoo's gaze turned sharp as he locked eyes with Thomas, his voice low and cold as he asked what would happen if he refused. Thomas bared his teeth, a growl in his tone, warning that the request was no longer open for negotiation. In a single, effortless motion, Jinwoo flung Dongsu's limp body aside. Dongsu crashed across the factory like a rag doll. And as his broken form lay sprawled, his last flicker of consciousness burned with hatred. In his mind, Dongsu urged Thomas to kill Jinwoo in his place, his eyes seething with malice. He knew he had succeeded in pushing Thomas to intervene, the one who could finish what he himself could not. Jinwoo now stood facing the indomitable Thomas Andre unshaken. No fear, no doubt, just quiet defiance. Thomas stepped forward, towering with power, his voice heavy with authority as he asked if Jinwoo truly understood who he was. Yet, Jinwoo's gaze remained icy and unwavering, silently asserting that he didn't care who Thomas was. It caught Thomas off guard. This wasn't ignorance. Jinwoo knew exactly who he was, and yet he didn't care. That kind of fearlessness, it was something Thomas hadn't seen in years. Memories of his own rise surged within him. Born into poverty, raised as an outsider, he'd never been exceptional. Until one day, the gift revealed itself. A terrifying talent for overwhelming violence. He sharpened it through endless fights, battles, and blood. Those who mocked him were silenced. Those who challenged him were crushed. And now, faced with a man who refused to bend, Thomas knew what had to be done. Time seemed to freeze as Thomas launched forward. His roar filled the air as his hand shot toward Jinwoo's skull, telling him to blame his ignorance for what was about to happen. Outside, the scavenger guild had finally arrived. Hunters moved to secure the perimeter until something massive came barreling at them like a missile. The ground quacked. Metal screeched. Something skidded across the floor and landed with brutal force at their feet. It was Thomas. Silence fell over the guild members. Eyes wide, breaths caught, their strongest, thrown like a rag doll. They rushed to his side, calling his name in panic. But Thomas raised a single hand, signaling them to stay back. His face was dark, his pride wounded deeper than his body. Without a word, he stormed back toward the factory, fury burning in every step. The vice guild master, stunned by the sight, snapped into action, yelling for everyone to prepare. The air was electric with tension. Inside, Jinwoo had already summoned Igris and Kyle. Igris appeared beside him, cradling the barely breathing Jinho in his arms. Jinwoo immediately ordered his summons to rush Jinho to the nearest hospital, making sure they did everything they could to save him. Igris bowed deeply, mounted Kyle, and the two vanished into the sky, streaking toward salvation. Back on the ground, scavengers full force poured into the factory. Dozens of elite hunters stood ready behind Thomas, but Jinwoo was not outnumbered. He raised a hand and shadows erupted across the floor like smoke. One after another, the shadow army emerged. Knights, beasts, giants, forming an unstoppable tide of darkness. Across the battlefield, Thomas grinned. For the first time in a long while, he had found someone who didn't fear his strength, someone who didn't kneel. This wasn't about Dongsu anymore. Now all that mattered to him was reclaiming his pride. And the only way to do that was by killing Jinwoo right then and there. There was no going back now. And Thomas knew it well. That's why he offered Jinwoo one last chance, urging him to admit his mistakes, back off, and apologize. In return, he promised to spare his life. But Jinwoo only stood still, expression cold and unreadable, as he slowly raised his middle finger toward the world's strongest hunter. That was the final straw. Fury exploded through Thomas as Jinwoo's blatant disrespect shattered any restraint he had left. He growled that the man would regret not taking his last chance, voice trembling with rage as a violent energy burst around him. His shirt ripped apart, revealing a chiseled body as his muscles swelled, hardening like armor, while a terrifying force surged beneath his feet. Behind both men, their forces gathered, locked and waiting. The moment commands were given, war erupted. The Scavenger Guild moved first, their front lines raising shields infused with mana, creating a shimmering defense. They formed a tight wall, bracing for impact. But Jinwoo's shadow army surged forward like a black tidal wave. Nearly 1,000 shadows collided with hundreds of top-tier hunters. The ground quaking with each impact as magic and brute force clashed. Thomas tore through the battlefield, his path cutting straight toward Tusk. The massive shadow mage raised his arms and summoned a thick barrier, but Thomas didn't slow. Slamming the ground, he launched himself skyward and came crashing down, shattering the magical wall and tearing Tusk's head clean off in one brutal strike. Hovering for a moment above the wreckage, Thomas sneered at the chaos below and mocked Jinwoo's forces before smashing down through the roof of a factory. Inside, the air was thick with violence. The Scavenger Guild was being overrun. Thomas saw his elite squad crumbling beneath the relentless tide of shadows. At the heart of it all stood Jinwoo, staring down at him, not with fury, but with something colder. Pity. Thomas charged forward without hesitation, but before he could reach his target, iron stepped into his path. The towering knight stood firm, yet was tossed aside like scrap as Thomas drove a fist through his shield and flung him across the room. His eyes snapped back to Jinwoo, only to find the man was gone. Then, with a flicker of black, Jinwoo appeared beside him and silently drove the demon monarch's dagger into his abdomen. But instead of cutting, the blade merely scraped along his hardened flesh. JYNW's eyes flicked with a hint of surprise. Thomas didn't waste the moment. He swung hard and the punch landed flush, sending Jinwoo flying across the factory floor. Standing tall, Thomas spat that Jinwoo had made the mistake of looking down on a national-level hunter. Then he raised a hand and an invisible force gripped Jinwoo midair. With a voice devoid of mercy, he told him to feel the difference in strength. Feel despair. But instead of struggling, Jinwoo responded with his own power. Ruler's authority exploded outward, slamming down on Thomas like a hammer and cracking the floor beneath him. He blinked in disbelief. Jinwoo wasn't resisting the pull. He was overpowering it. Jinwoo blurred forward and his punch smashed into Thomas's face, blood spraying as the hunter staggered back. For the first time in his life, Thomas tasted his own blood. Jinwoo's voice cut through the tension as he rushed in again, mockingly asking, "What happened to all that talk about despair?" Fists flew and Thomas found himself being pushed back, struggling to keep up. Shocked by the relentless precision behind every blow, he realized he had grossly underestimated this opponent. Blood dripping from his mouth, he snarled the single word, "Reinforcement." Jinwoo braced as Thomas transformed. His body swelled past 3 meters tall, now encased in golden armor with black horns curling back from his head. His hair blazed like wildfire, his entire form pulsing with raw power. Jinwoo's thoughts raced back to Kamish's warning about 4 humans who had borrowed power from the rulers. As he watched Thomas, the meaning became clear. These were the national-level hunters with mystical powers, and Thomas André was unmistakably one of them. Even so, Jinwoo didn't falter. He launched forward, but Thomas slammed his fists into the ground, unleashing a shock wave that tore through the terrain and obliterated everything nearby. Jinwoo leaped back, narrowly, avoiding blast just in time. Thomas created a gravitational zone next, pulling everything toward him in a deadly vortex. Jinwoo's shadows were dragged into the spiral, distorted and scattered. But the hunter pushed back with his own force, resisting the pull as Thomas built up mana above his head, shaping it into a massive energy sphere. He released it without warning. The blast carved out a massive crater, annihilating everything in its radius. Jinwoo landed just beyond the edge, crouching low as the air trembled. Thomas stood within the crater, panting and warned coldly that he wouldn't miss next time. At the edge of the battlefield, the Vice Guild Master of Scavengers shouted for retreat, yelling at his team to get the wounded out and fall back. But Thomas charged again, ignoring it all. Jinwoo met him midair, his kick smashing into Thomas's head and hurling him across the ground. Thomas retaliated by activating another pull, but Jinwoo used Ruler's authority to accelerate, blasting toward him with explosive speed. Their fists collided in a deafening crash. Yet, despite Thomas's reinforced armor, it cracked. And the force of Jinwoo's punch sent him crashing through a factory wall, tearing through debris and steel. Jinwoo landed lightly, calm, and focused. Thomas emerged from the rubble, roaring with rage. He charged again, swinging his fist, but Jinwoo ducked beneath the attack and avoided the shockwave. In a blur, Jinwoo gripped Thomas by his horns and drove his knee into his face with devastating power, cracking more of the golden armor. Meanwhile, Hunter Bureau vehicles arrived and came to a screeching halt. Agents stood in stunned silence, the overwhelming magical pressure in the air paralyzing them. One figure crashed violently into the ground, and the earth trembled. Adam's face turned pale. He instantly recognized the wreckage and the man within it. It was Thomas Andre. No one could believe it. A national-level hunter was being beaten. Overwhelmed by Sung Jinwoo, Thomas tried to rise again, but Jinwoo was already on him. His punches rained down like hammers. Every hit targeted weak points. Each blow pushed Thomas closer to collapse. Doubt and confusion seeped into Thomas's mind. How could a mage-type hunter have such speed, such raw power? This wasn't possible, but it was happening. Blood filled his mouth. Yet, pride wouldn't let him quit. With blood-stained teeth, Thomas clenched his jaw and roared that he was Thomas Andre, that this wouldn't be enough to bring him down. But Jinwoo didn't stop. He shifted behind him in a blink, elbowing him in the neck and driving the towering warrior into the ground again. His voice was cold, almost pitying, as he muttered that he didn't care who Thomas was. The Bureau agents and scavenger hunters stood frozen. None dared intervene. They could only watch, helpless, as their most powerful ally was being crushed. Adam finally ran toward them, shouting desperately for Jinwoo to stop, pleading with him to end it. But Jinwoo didn't pause. His attacks continued, relentless, precise. The upper armor of Thomas's body was now gone, and his torso was fully exposed. Blood dripped from his face. His strength waned, and just as Jinwoo wound up for one final devastating punch, Thomas, barely conscious, parted his lips. The words came slowly, weakly, but they were clear. He had admitted defeat. His body slumped. The fight drained from him, conceding that the battle was over. With that, Jinwoo halted, his clenched fist suspended for a moment before he slowly lowered it, standing silently over the fallen Thomas. Onlookers were left speechless, struggling to comprehend the sight before them. Thomas Andre, one of the world's most powerful national-level hunters, lay broken on the ground, a symbol of overwhelming strength reduced to a battered figure. The image was especially jarring for Adam. How many hunters in the world could defeat Thomas Andre? He wondered. Was there ever anyone who could to begin with? In all his years working for the Bureau, he had never seen anyone even come close. And now, watching the impossible unfold, the truth struck him like a thunderbolt. Once news of Thomas's defeat spread, it would shake the entire world to its core. Snapping back to reality, Adam wasted no time and called for the healers. One of the highest-ranking among them rushed to Thomas's side, checking his vitals before immediately casting healing magic. His expression darkened as he assessed the damage. Thomas's body was wrecked beyond belief. Every bone shattered, blood flowing freely, his life hanging by a thread. Realizing his magic alone wouldn't be enough, the healer called out to the others. While the healers focused on their life or death struggle, Hunter Command Center staff swarmed the ruins of the factory, evacuating the wounded and surveying the damage. Amid the chaos, Adam stood quietly, watching it all unfold with a heavy heart. He reassured himself that given the way things could have gone, this might have been the best possible outcome. But the devastation, the raw brutality of the battle couldn't be ignored. Then an officer ran toward him, snapping him out of his thoughts. The man's face was pale, and his voice was grim as he reported the worst of it. S-rank hunter Hang Donggu wasn't breathing. Far from the wreckage, seated silently atop a tall building overlooking the Korean skyline, Jinho watched the city beneath him. He had used shadow exchange to return, swapping places with Baru, who remained behind in America to heal Jinho to the best of his abilities. As his mind wandered through the echoes of battle, a deep, unfamiliar voice broke the silence, respectfully addressing him as king. Jinho turned his gaze toward the source and found a towering shadow soldier kneeling before him, the energy radiating off him, marking him as a knight-level commander. With his head bowed, the soldier humbly asked for a name. Jinho studied him for a moment, remembering the greed that had consumed the man in his final moments, and settled on the name Greed, thinking it suited him well. As his gaze fixed on the familiar face beneath the shadows, he asked flatly whether Huang Dongsu liked his new name or not. The once proud S-rank hunter, now reborn as a part of the Shadow Army, bowed deeper and gave thanks for the name. Jinho's expression didn't change. He simply told him to return his head to the ground, bringing the conversation to a close. With that, he looked back over the cityscape of Korea. The battle was over, but the war he knew was only beginning. The next day in the United States, the International Guild Conference finally commenced as Jinho arrived at the prestigious venue, escorted by the deputy director of the Hunter Bureau. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing in rapid bursts. Jinho, clearly confused by the attention, asked about the commotion. The deputy director explained that the public had somehow caught wind of the fierce battle between him and Thomas Andre, and from this point on it would be impossible to avoid the spotlight. He was now the central figure of the entire conference. He also reassured Jinho that the testimony from Dongsu's party had clarified the incident and the truth would eventually surface, with no blame falling on his shoulders. But Jinho wasn't focused on Dongsu anymore. The chaos and speculation didn't concern him. His purpose for coming to America was clear. Once his questions were answered, he had no intention of staying. When they arrived at the conference building, the deputy handed him an earpiece, assuring Jinho that he'd translate the presentation throughout the event. As Jinho stepped inside, the air shifted. Conversations died out and all eyes turned toward him. Some of the hunters and officials studied him with curiosity, others with doubt, but a heavy mix of awe and unease hung in the air as they tried to grasp the power of the man who had just walked in. Whispers rose as Jinho made his way down the steps. Speculations buzzed from every corner about the man who had defeated the indomitable Thomas Andre. Some recalled his feat of clearing the S-rank gate in Tokyo, while others simply tried to make sense of his presence. Jinho ignored the murmurs and calmly took his seat as the conference began. A keynote speaker stepped onto the stage and introduced himself as Dr. Belzer before diving straight into the topic that had brought the world's top hunters and officials together. He stated that the number of gates appearing worldwide had surged and with them more powerful monsters had begun to emerge. Yet something else had occurred. An unusual activity detected high above the skies. Dr. Belzer explained that the magical energy concentration in the atmosphere had been increasing dramatically, a phenomenon they had named the Magisphere. Behind him, a world map lit up the screen, pinpointing the regions where this energy was densest. There were 9 major hotspots scattered across the globe, but one location stood out above the rest: South Korea. The moment Dr. Belzer mentioned it, all eyes shifted toward Jinho again. Murmurs grew louder and tension rippled through the crowd. Still, Dr. Belzer attempted to ease their nerves, stating that if Jinho were indeed the cause of this phenomenon, then he would be far beyond the scope of any ordinary hunter. Jinho remained still, lost in thought. The number of locations matched the number of monarchs. Could this be connected? Dr. Belzer admitted that they still didn't know what caused the Magisphere nor how to stop it. But whatever was coming, it would bring significant change to the world. They had to prepare. As the presentation wrapped up, the Bureau's director, David Brennan, took the stage for a pressing announcement. His voice was low and heavy with the weight of the news. Christopher Reed had been assassinated by a group of unknown assailants. The crowd fell into stunned silence. The idea that a hunter of Christopher's caliber could be killed sent a chill through the room. Speculation flared instantly. Who could possibly do this? More eyes turned toward Jinwoo, whispers connecting the dots between Thomas Andre's defeat and Christopher's death. Jinwoo remained impassive as David raised a hand to calm the speculation, urging the audience not to jump to conclusions. The Bureau had already identified a suspect, he announced. Jinwoo's gaze sharpened as an image flickered to life on the screen behind David. The man identified as Suspect S was believed to be responsible for the murder of Christopher Reed. The audience stared at the image, confused. It wasn't Jinwoo, but the resemblance was uncanny, too close, too precise. Meanwhile, Jinwoo clenched his jaw in frustration, questioning his father's motives. As his thoughts raced, he recalled something crucial. Dungeons were the domain of the rulers, a fact now tangled with his father's sudden reappearance. He remembered what Kamish had told him about 4 humans who had once borrowed the ruler's strength. The words echoed in his mind as he pondered the possibility. Why would a ruler send someone who looked like his father? Could this truly be connected to what Kamish had said? David pressed on, revealing that the suspect had been caught on camera months ago during a devastating incident with Dongsu that reduced an entire section of the Bureau's headquarters to flames. Footage began playing on screen. Suspect S stood over Dongsu's unconscious form. Jinwoo's soldier, greed, gave him a silent confirmation. There was no doubt the man in the footage was his father. David explained that the association would request the aid of all guilds to locate and apprehend the suspect. If any sightings occurred, they were to be reported immediately. The questions came flooding in. One hunter asked whether there was proof that Suspect S wasn't human. David confirmed that his magical signature matched that of a monster. Then came a delicate question. Why wasn't the identity of Suspect S being shared with the public? David paused before answering. The suspect, he said, was connected to one of the hunters in the room. For now, the association had decided to keep his identity confidential. A hand went up from the back row. Lu Jiagong, China's 7-star hunter and a national-level powerhouse, stood and asked directly, what was the nature of Suspect S's connection to hunter Sung Jinwoo? David hesitated. Then, finally, he said it. He revealed that during the interrogation, Suspect S had claimed to be Jinwoo's father. The Bureau had no reason to doubt the claim and was treating the investigation accordingly. The room erupted in gasps. Shock rolled through the audience in waves. Lu Jiagong turned to Jinwoo and asked the question everyone else was afraid to voice. If Suspect S truly was his father, what would Jinwoo do if the world's hunters tried to bring him down? Jinwoo's answer came without hesitation. He calmly replied that if Suspect S truly was a monster, then it was only natural for hunters to hunt monsters. And if that were the case, he would personally take him down himself. But if the suspect was truly his father and not a monster, then Jinwoo, eyes cold and burning with silent menace, made his vow clear. He would protect his family and wouldn't hesitate to hunt down those hunters, even if it meant becoming the enemy of every single one in the world. As the International Guild Conference drew to a close, Jinwoo stepped out of the building, only to be greeted by Adam White waiting outside. With a slightly cautious tone, Adam asked if Jinwoo had truly meant what he said back in the meeting. Without a hint of hesitation, Jinwoo nodded and confirmed he did. Adam let out a soft chuckle, half in awe and half in disbelief, and remarked that there were only 2 hunters in the entire world who would dare to say something like that in front of so many powerful hunters. With a faintly embarrassed smile, Adam gestured vaguely and said the other person was currently lying in a hospital bed. Jinwoo immediately understood the image of a broken but defiant Thomas Andre flashing in his mind. Trying to shift the mood, Adam suggested Jinwoo join the banquet hosted by the Hunters Association. But Jinwoo's attention drifted as he noticed a presence approaching. The heavy commanding aura of Lu Jiagong accompanied by a small group of subordinates. The atmosphere instantly shifted. Conversations died down and every eye in the vicinity turned to the approaching Chinese hunter. Lu stepped forward and said something in Mandarin, his tone calm but resolute. Jinwoo turned slightly, his expression calm, and asked Adam what the man had said. Adam listened for a moment and then explained that Lu claimed to have caught a giant monster on the coast of China, one that Jinwoo had supposedly allowed to escape. Jinwoo remained silent as Lu continued speaking. Adam translated as fast as he could, explaining that Lu had been caught off guard by the monster's power. The battle had been especially difficult, taking place on the open sea. Lu had always wondered what kind of hunter could deal with such monsters so easily. And now, standing in front of Jinwoo, he finally had his answer. Then Lu extended a hand, offering a firm handshake. He said he had wanted to meet Jinwoo for a while now. He added that he was glad Thomas Andre had been put in his place, and he had no doubt Thomas had been in the wrong. Jinwoo looked at him with new eyes. His initial impression had been that Lu Jiagong was just a grumpy man with a stiff attitude, but now listening to his words, he found him far more intriguing. The two hunters shook hands firmly. Just as Lu was about to leave, he paused and uttered one last sentence in Mandarin. Adam's eyes narrowed slightly as he translated, his voice just a little more hushed. Lu had said he hoped Suspect S wasn't someone related to Jinwoo's family. Once again, silence fell around them. The air grew heavy under the weight of that final remark as Lu Jiagong and his team quietly left the event behind. Adam reassured Jinwoo that Lu Jiagong didn't seem to harbor any ill intent, adding that the Chinese hunter had even said he never wanted to fight him. Jinwoo remained calm, nodding slightly, and replied that it was all right, showing no trace of concern. Moments later, David Brennan entered the room and gestured for Jinwoo to follow him. As they walked down a quiet corridor toward a private meeting room, Jinwoo's eyes narrowed slightly in surprise. Inside the room, he found Norma Selner seated on the sofa. He hadn't expected to see her again. Without masking his curiosity, Jinwoo asked what business Miss Selner had with him. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of unease as she explained that she had been having recurring dreams. Visions in which top hunters were being hunted down by someone. The disturbing part, she added, was that each time she had one of those dreams, the event would come true only a few days later. The weight of her words settled heavily. Jinwoo's voice dropped as he asked whether Christopher Reed had been among them. David nodded and confirmed that they had indeed warned Christopher about the danger, but he hadn't listened, and they all knew how that had ended. With concern tightening her features, Miss Selner continued, saying that the hunters who had been pillars of strength in this world, the ones humanity had relied on, were going to keep dying. The force hunting them would not stop until they were all eliminated. Jinwoo's eyes narrowed as he absorbed the implications. He asked if Miss Selner was here to warn him of the same fate, but she shook her head. That wasn't her reason. She hadn't come to warn him. She had come to ask for his help. For the first time, confusion stirred beneath Jin's composed exterior. Miss Selner explained that she wanted him to protect the remaining hunters who were still alive. She'd tried remembering the faces of the culprits from her dreams, but no matter how hard she tried, the memories slipped away. So, she said she had decided to take a different approach, one that involved using her ability within the dream itself to identify them. Jinwoo recalled their last encounter and finally understood why she had looked into his eyes so intently back then. She had been searching for something. Her voice trembled as she recounted what happened that day. There had been a voice, an entity speaking to her from within Jinwoo. When Jinwoo asked what that voice had said, she lowered her gaze, visibly shaken, and replied that it had told her to go back and prepare for war. The word struck Jinwoo like a blade of ice. His mind began racing. He remembered the King of Giants' warnings about the battle between the rulers and the monarchs. Could these hunters' deaths be part of that larger conflict? Still trying to put the pieces together, Jinwoo asked why she had chosen him specifically to protect the others. Miss Selner didn't hesitate. She had seen a power within him. The same overwhelming energy that had appeared in her dreams. Jinwoo instantly realized what she meant. It was the power of the Shadow Monarch. If she had sensed the same presence in the hunter's killers, then those attackers must be monarchs as well. David's voice broke in, explaining that the threat they faced was far beyond anything normal hunters could handle. These beings were on a different level entirely, and they needed someone like Jinwoo, someone powerful enough to stop them. He added that the Bureau was willing to offer anything in return for Jinwoo's help. even the runestone left behind by the dragon Kamish. David's voice grew more serious as he stressed that the hunters in question weren't just powerful, they were essential. They were the last barrier protecting humanity. If they fell, there would be nothing left to stop future catastrophes. Jinho sat quietly for a long moment, weighing it all. Then, with firm resolve, he declined the offer. David stared in disbelief. Shocked, he asked whether Jin's rejection was because of some lingering resentment toward Thomas Andre after their clash. But Jinho made it clear that wasn't the reason. The truth was simpler and far more important. He still didn't know who the real enemy was. Until he understood that, he couldn't commit to anything. Rising from his seat, Jinho turned toward the door. But just as he reached it, he paused. Something pulled at him. Without turning, he called out for Adam White. When Adam approached, Jinho asked him to provide the list of hunters the Bureau wanted him to protect. And then, almost as an afterthought, he asked Adam to arrange a meeting with them. Adam's eyes lit up, clearly relieved and more than a little excited. He nodded eagerly, already preparing to set things in motion. The final day of the International Guild Conference had arrived, and the banquet hall brimmed with the presence of the world's strongest hunters and their entourages. Amid the grand celebration, Jinho stood beside Jinho, who had finally returned from the hospital. When Jinho asked about his condition, Jinho, his eyes misty with emotion, replied that he felt better than ever. He confessed that he had been deeply moved upon learning Jinho had fought Thomas Andre the Goliath himself, all for his sake. Nearby hunters watched them from a distance, speaking in hushed tones as they observed Jinho with awe. Despite being right in front of them, his presence was completely undetectable. To them, Jinho wasn't just powerful. He was on a level they couldn't even fathom. A man soon approached, introducing himself as the CEO of a global firm dealing in monster remains. With a businesslike smile, he expressed interest in purchasing the bodies of the giants Jinho had hunted and asked if he had time to talk. Jinho responded coolly that he didn't handle business affairs himself, then nodded toward Jinho, saying the vice chairman of the Ahjin Guild oversaw those matters. The two men stepped aside to talk, and Jinho watched them go with quiet pride, pleased to see Jinho growing into his role. Before long, Adam arrived at the banquet holding a tablet in hand. He handed it to Jinho and explained that it contained the names of the top 10 hunters ranked by points, a system based on contribution, mission success, and activity. These individuals, he added, were considered priority targets, and if Jinho chose to help, the Bureau would likely ask him to protect them. Jinho asked where he ranked on the list. Adam chuckled and answered that he was likely in 3rd or 4th place, mostly due to his performance against the giants. Thomas Andre topped the list, followed by Luja Gang, then Christopher Reed and Siddharth. Jinho skimmed the list briefly, already finding it tiresome to commit the names to memory. Instead, he silently dispatched shadow soldiers to each hunter. Through them, he could stay aware of their conditions and potentially communicate with the rulers, making it easier to discern friend from foe in the coming conflict. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of slow, heavy footsteps. A familiar pressure filled the room as an overwhelming aura approached. Jinho, standing nearby, leaned in slightly and tried to speak, but Jinho cut him off calmly, assuring him that it wasn't something he needed to worry about. Then Thomas Andre stepped into view. One arm was encased in a cast, a clear reminder of their previous battle. He walked up to Jinho, eyes steady, and explained that despite the efforts of doctors and healers, his arm still hadn't fully recovered. Jinho's magic power had done too much damage. While healing was underway, it was progressing slowly. Thomas paused, reflecting aloud on the battle. He admitted that Jinho could have easily wiped out his entire guild that day, and yet no one had died except Huang Dongsu, who had brought it upon himself. He then asked why Jinho had chosen to show such restraint. Jinho's response was simple. He said that Thomas's guild had committed no crime worthy of death. That explanation seemed to satisfy the Goliath, who nodded with a mix of understanding and respect. He stated his intention to hold a grand funeral for Dongsu, not to excuse his actions, but to honor him in death. As he turned to leave, Thomas made a final request. Once his arm was fully healed, he hoped they could share a meal together. He asked Jinwoo to leave his contact details with his manager so they could arrange it. Laura stepped forward, then politely requesting Jinwoo's information, explaining that Thomas also wished to send a gift in appreciation. Jinwoo initially declined, saying there was nothing he needed, but Laura gently insisted. Her master, she said, was a competitive man who disliked owing anyone favors. Even something small would ease his mind. After a short pause, Jinwoo relented, suggesting that a good dagger would do. Laura smiled at the request, thanked him, and followed after Thomas. Once she was gone, Adam reappeared and suggested they begin introductions with the hunters on the list. But Jinwoo shook his head, saying there was no need anymore. His eyes flicked over the list as he asked about the 6th-ranked hunter, noting that the name was conspicuously absent. Adam looked momentarily taken aback. He admitted that the Bureau had lost contact with the hunter just days before the conference. Even the Brazilian government and their secret agencies hadn't been able to track him down. Jinwoo's expression darkened. There was a chance that the hunter had already been eliminated. With Thomas Andre and Christopher Reed no longer part of the equation and one hunter missing, that left 7 names, 7 more he needed to cast his shadow on. The party was still in full swing in America, while night had already draped Korea in quiet darkness. Inside the Korean Hunter Association, President Go sat alone at his desk, the soft rustle of paperwork, the only sound in the room. Yet, it wasn't the documents or late hours that weighed on him. It was something deeper, heavier. His heart, for some time now, had refused to beat normally. It had begun years ago, a subtle discomfort that had only grown more persistent. Recently, the unease had become impossible to ignore. His heart pounded with unnatural force, not from exertion, but as if sounding an alarm that his end could be near. A quiet scoff escaped his lips. The doctors had told him this would happen if he kept pushing himself. Yet he had ignored their warnings, fully aware he'd long since crossed those limits, and it was nothing short of a miracle that he was still standing. Then the shrill ring of a phone pierced the silence. He reached for it without hesitation. On the other end was the gentle voice of his wife, soft with concern, asking if he was all right. Her words, though brief, brought a rare comfort. He leaned back in his chair and assured her that he was just finishing up and would be home soon. But midway through his reply, a bizarre and eerie sensation suddenly pulled at his attention. Something felt off. He turned his eyes toward the window, and what he saw froze him in place. The skyline, the traffic, the lights, everything had been swallowed by an oppressive black void. Panic began to creep in as he struggled to make sense of what was happening. But then, a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him stop cold. He turned. There, seated on the couch as if he owned the room, was a man he had never seen before. He sat casually, a faint grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. Cold air seemed to radiate from him, the kind that didn't belong to this world. The Frost Monarch had arrived. That wraps up the International Guild Conference arc. Stay tuned for the upcoming parts. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part when it drops. I'll see you in the next one as we dive into a brand new chapter.